All right, here we go. Welcome to the Otherppl podcast, a weekly program featuring in-depth interviews with today's leading writers. I'm Brad Listi here in Los Angeles. It's nice to be with you. I appreciate you tuning in. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button wherever you listen. You can also subscribe on YouTube, and you can follow me on Bluesky and Instagram. So my guest today is Jane Borden, author of a new book called Cults Like Us, Why Doomsday Thinking Drives America. It is available from Atria, and it is a book about cults and cultish thinking and the general cultiness of America. And the thesis of the book is that the tendency toward this type of like communal arrangement, this kind of ideological arrangement, has its roots all the way back in the original colonization of the Americas. It goes all the way back to our Puritan days. And it's a really riveting and fascinating work of pop history that helps to contextualize like the present day, what's happening now with far-right extremism and really intense religious movements that are kind of embedded into political movements. It helps you make sense of the chaos, which I think was maybe part of the impetus for Jane writing it, trying to kind of sort this stuff out. So I had a really fascinating conversation with Jane about her very fascinating book. Again, it is called Cults Like Us, Why Doomsday Thinking Drives America. You will hear Jane and I talking to one another in just a bit. Today's episode is brought to you by Penguin Press, publisher of Pan, the debut novel by Michael Clune. Pan tells the story of a strange and brilliant teenager's first panic attacks and how they lead him down the rabbit hole. This is a very hotly anticipated debut novel from one of our most distinctive literary minds. Michael Clune is also the author of the critically acclaimed memoir, Whiteout, The Secret Life of Heroin. And now he has announced himself as a writer of fiction of the first rank, with a psychedelic novel and a timeless coming-of-age story. This book, Pan, was longlisted for the Center for Fiction's 2025 First Novel Prize. Kaveh Akbar calls it, quote, deliciously observed, ferociously strange. Like a great painter, Michael Clune can show us the mind, the world, with just a few well-placed verbs. Once again, the book is called Pan, the debut novel by Michael Clune, available right now from Penguin Press. So a quick reminder about my email newsletter before we get going. I have one, as it turns out. You can subscribe over at bradlisti.substack.com. I would love it if you did. My newsletter is very simple and very user-friendly, I hope. It essentially functions as a way for me to let you know about the latest episodes of the show each week, and I also share a list of links to things that I've been reading and finding interesting. So that's it. If you want to hear from me once a week in your inbox, you can sign up over at bradlisti.substack.com. Also, I have some really big news to share. Deep Dive, my new company, will be officially launching on Tuesday. So Tuesday, August 12th, Deep Dive goes live. At that time, you can purchase the debut course from Deep Dive. It is called How to Write a Novel, and it features more than 50 hours of never-before-heard conversations with dozens of today's most celebrated contemporary authors. Everybody from Emily St. John Mandel to Jerry Stahl to Steve Almond to Vivi Ganeshananthan to Hannah Pittard, to Lynn Steger-Strong, Deb Olin Unferth, Antoine Wilson, Matt Bell, Matthew Salasis, Porchista Hakpour, Gina Frangello, Todd Goldberg, Maya Binyam, Stephen Graham Jones, Tiffany Clark Harrison, and so many more. So I like to think of this course as being commensurate with the task at hand. Writing a novel is a big project. A course about writing a novel should be big. And I also like to think of this course as being something that can accompany you over the long haul as you work to complete a draft of your novel. So this has definitely been a labor of love. I don't know if you can hear the fatigue in my voice, but it's been a long haul getting here. I've been working on this for more than a year now, and it's going to go live on Tuesday, August 12th. You can buy the course. The early bird special for how to write a novel is $297. $297 for more than 50 hours of insight and instruction. Plus, there are, I think, more than 20 hours of bonus content included in the course, drawn from the Otherppl archives. So it's going to be an incredibly rich resource for writers, and I'm thrilled to share it with you. Once again, it goes live on Tuesday. You can purchase the course at deepdive.audio, www.deepdive.audio, and you can stream it online. Like if you're wondering, like, how do I listen to this course? You can stream it online, or you can stream it via the Deep Dive app, which will be available for both iPhone and Android. So it's meant to be user-friendly and convenient. It's meant to be the kind of course that you can easily integrate into the chaos of everyday life. You don't have to be planted in front of your computer in order to listen to the course. You can be anywhere. You can be at the gym. You can be commuting. You can be cleaning the house, whatever it is. And once you buy it, it's yours. You can listen to it as many times as you want, in whatever order you want. And it's going to help people write their books. So again, www.deepdive.audio. It goes live on Tuesday, August 12th. That's launch day. You can follow Deep Dive on Bluesky and Instagram, and I hope you buy the course. I would love that. And I would love to hear from you if you do. The address is feedback@deepdive.audio. Let me know what you think. And otherwise, I think it is now time for today's main event, my conversation with Jane Borden about her book, Cults Like Us, Why Doomsday Thinking Drives America. It is available from Atria. Jane Borden, in addition to being an author, also works as a culture journalist. She has written for a variety of publications, including Vanity Fair, the New York Times Magazine, and the Washington Post. We had a great talk, and I'm very pleased to share it with you right now. This is Jane Borden's first appearance on the Otherppl show, so she's making her debut. And let's get to it. Here I am with Jane Borden, and her book, once again, is called Cults Like Us.
So back in 2017, my editor at Vanity Fair asked me to develop some ideas of stories we could do about NXIVM. This was when Keith Raniere had been arrested, and it was all being shaken down.
Just to interrupt, NXIVM is a cult.
Yes. NXIVM is a self-help kind of workshop / MLM / sex slave cult. They really checked all the boxes. But it was up in Albany. It was based in Albany, but there was a large contingent. There was a large Hollywood contingent because cults often recruit actors. And so when I was looking into that, I became especially interested in the fact that cults recruit actors. And I became interested in how many cults have occurred in California and in Southern California, especially. And so the first piece I did on this beat was about the myth of California as cult country, because we tend to have this idea in America that California is full of a bunch of kooky oddballs pinballing around out here. But in reality, it's more circumstantial than that. There has been, no doubt, a rich history of cults in California, but the reasons are more circumstantial. So for starters, historically speaking, the mainline churches, the major denominations, didn't really get a foothold out west for quite some time. And so all the people who were living out here were what scholars call unchurched, which just means they were looking for communities. And so a lot of alternative communities sprung up out here, whether Christian or not. And of course, a lot of con artists saw in that an opportunity. Oh, people are looking to follow someone. Well, I can be that person and take all their money. And so that's one of the major reasons. And then additionally, cults seek money, as I just mentioned. And so con artists portraying themselves as gurus have always gone after the wealthy. And that made San Francisco and Los Angeles in particular hotbeds for religious con artistry. And then finally, cults need to recruit. So they're always looking for people with platforms. And that's why they go after celebrities. And that's why they're so interested in Hollywood. And that's another of the major reasons why Southern California in particular has been such a hotbed for cultic activity. And then after that, I just started pitching more stories about cults because I've always been interested in this. I was a religious studies major in college. I've always been fascinated by the intersection of belief and identity. And with this book specifically, the thesis of this book specifically, what happened is that while I was reporting on cults, we were in the first Trump presidency, and I was seeing exactly how divided our nation is culturally and politically, and was curious as to why. In reality, most Americans have so much more in common than they have that distinguishes us. And I was just wondering about the root of that. And I started seeing everywhere in American culture and politics, pop culture, entertainment, the same kinds of dynamics at play that I was learning about while reporting on cults. And I thought, well, that's strange. And so I started pulling the thread, the roots of American division, things like our knee-jerk anti-intellectualism. Where does that come from, right? The kind of chosen nation thing. Some of us are chosen, the rest of us are sinners. This hierarchy that we create that fuels division, that fuels us versus them thinking. And America's always had a chosen nation, chosen people thing. Where does that come from, right? This belief in perfectionism, this idea that we can even achieve it, much less how often in American history we have tried. Where does that come from? So I'm pulling these threads and everything just goes back to the Puritans. And one day it sort of dawned on me. I was like, oh, I think the Puritans were kind of a cult. I think if most people looked at them today, they would say, that looks like a cult to me. And that's really where the idea of my book was generated. And so what I do is I identify and then trace certain tenets of Puritan doomsday ideology through secular American history, and to showcase where it is in plain sight. And so often when I tell people the concept of my book, the first immediate reaction is their minds are blown, and then immediately they go, of course, right? We know this. We all know it. We just aren't acknowledging it. We just aren't recognizing it. And so that's one of the goals of my book, is to point it out, really, to point out the magic trick, because what happens is when we're latently indoctrinated into these doomsday ideologies, they get used to manipulate us. We're more credulous to not just cult leaders, but con artists, and especially now, demagogues. And so I'm trying to say, let's acknowledge this so we stop falling for it.
Yeah, I think the narratives that our political leadership propagates, or has certainly been propagating for a long time and all throughout my lifetime, about the history of this country and ideally what it stands for, are markedly different than the actual true history of this country, which is a lot darker and a lot messier in places than I think we often want to admit to ourselves. Then you get to this place in history, 2025, where we're either on the precipice of authoritarianism or in a free fall at this point towards authoritarianism. And I think it's a very natural question to ask, how did we get here? And I think your book speaks eloquently to that question. It's easier to understand maybe why we're here when you look back into the history and you start with the Puritans and then you start with the Massachusetts Bay Colony. I do want to flag that I don't think there was a charismatic guru leader among the Pilgrims.
Yes, exactly. So the distinction, the reason I say the Puritans look like a cult is because if we use the definition that's now been accepted among the anti-cult community for what constitutes a destructive cult, and that comes to us by way of Robert J. Lifton, a psychiatrist, This was developed in the late 20th century. So that definition has three characteristics. One, there's a leader who's worshipped, and the worshiping part is important. Two, there is undue influence at play, thought reform, mind control, what we used to call brainwashing. And three, actual harm is done to the members of the group. Typically, that's financial and sexual exploitation. So if we look at that, then the Puritans would not technically be a cult because they did not have a charismatic leader. Now, you could argue that Jesus was their charismatic leader, but he had been gone for 1,600 years by that point. The church magistrates did hold excessive control. Whether or not they were worshipped is a question. I refer to the Puritans as a high control group, a high control doomsday group. Specifically, high control groups and cults are somewhat interchangeable, but there is that distinction. Yeah,
they often have like an apocalyptic narrative that's kind of guiding them or fueling them, right? Like the end of the world is often nigh in a cult.
Yes, absolutely. Because I call it the cult watch. It's always striking at now o'clock, right? You better act fast, because the world's about to end. And first of all, what do you need all your earthly possessions for if the world's going to end? Give them to me. But then also, is there any bigger mission in life than to spread the word about this before it occurs? No. So drop everything. Right. And often the doomsday is somewhat more metaphorical in modern cults. But if you dig deep enough, you can usually find something like that going on.
So if we look all the way back to the Puritans landing on the East Coast of America to the present day, does MAGA strike you as culty? Like, do we have like an echo, or is it a high control group? Like, how would you define MAGA?
I think it's very culty. And to be clear, certain sections on the left and the right have fallen prey to cult-like thinking over the years, right? I'm by no means trying to exemplify the same kind of division that hurts my heart so much, but yeah, I would say MAGA is absolutely culty. It's a modern manifestation of this. It's a modern echo. So people talk about QAnon. Is QAnon a cult? And the argument against it is that there's no leader who's worshipped. But when you look at the intersection, because there's absolutely thought reform at play and there's absolutely harm being done to followers. But when you look at the intersection of QAnon and MAGA, Donald Trump very much becomes that charismatic leader who's worshipped in QAnon circles, right? He was the savior who was going to drain the swamp and arrest all of these supposed pedophile predators gathering in pizzeria basements or whatever it was. So there are absolutely cultic characteristics to what's happening right now in MAGA. And the worship of Trump is one of the biggest flags. America
seems unique in its predisposition toward this kind of thinking and like community building, if that's a way to put it. Correct? Like, I mean, when you study this stuff, were you just solely focused on America, or did you have a more global perspective? Are there other countries that are this bananas when it comes to this stuff, or is this like our special gift?
Cults are definitely everywhere. They're a human phenomenon, no doubt. I do believe we are more prone at the societal level toward cult-like thinking than perhaps other cultures are at the societal level, because we were founded by a high control group, and their doomsday ideology didn't just go away. It became the foundation of American culture, literally in our DNA, and developed with us as we grew. So also America has its own specific flavor, which of course I explore, but for sure cults happen everywhere. It's estimated that there are 10,000 cults in America right now, and the number in Europe is about the same. So it's a human tendency to fall into us versus them thinking. It's a human tendency to fall prey to the kind of con artists who ask you to drop everything and join them. Thought reform works on human psychology. But when you're talking about cult-like thinking at the societal level. And there have been other movements outside of America. Marxism and Nazism have both been considered cult-like movements by scholars. But I do believe that in America, we are more prone to that culturally kind of thinking. Yeah.
So when it comes to America as like a hotbed for like cult activities, if we're going to take that as fact, that America is like more predisposed than any other country to this sort of thing and has like a higher concentration, I guess the question is why. Like I'll take a stab at it and then you can respond. Like I think it might have something to do with the individualism or the hyper-individualism of American culture in relationship, I think, in particular to other Western democracies, which maybe have like a more communal bearing than we do. And so you have all of these people feeling isolated, sort of in the manner that you described earlier when you were talking about California of yore, when people were unchurched. Mm-hmm. So you have people kind of floating and feeling isolated and maybe looking for community. And so they're easy marks for this sort of thing. Like, am I on the right track?
Isolation definitely leads people to join groups like this. Yes, for sure. People join cults in times when they're unmoored, is a term you hear a lot. Literally just meaning they aren't being tied down, whether that's a church or a community, and also during times of crisis. And so people join cults after they've lost a loved one, or after a bad breakup, or they've just moved from home to go to college and they don't have any friends yet. That's why cults recruit so much on college campuses. So it's times when we're alone. And to your point about isolation, I believe part of why cult-like thinking is flaring so much at the societal level right now is the result of the isolation that has been developed from social media use, which several experts have determined is isolating us, making us more lonely. I describe social media algorithms as perhaps the most successful cult leaders of all time because of this effect, because they feed us extreme content, which divides us. They spread disinformation, which divides us from anyone who believes the truth. They literally mitigate our ability to discern what's true and not true. They isolate us from our loved ones. They cordon us off into groups of like-minded thinkers. And of course, the goal, as is the goal of a cult leader, is to extract from us. In the case of social media, it's our attention for their advertisers and our data, which they can sell. So I see a lot of commonalities there.
I think a natural question to ask, since you wrote this book, is like, do you have any experience in a cult yourself? Have you ever been have you ever been unmoored to the point where you joined a cult, either intentionally or not?
I'm a pretty moored person. There was a time in my early 20s when I moved to New York after college and fell into the improv comedy community. And my parents and sisters, I learned later, actually had a conference call at one point to check in on me. They were concerned one of my sisters was living in New York at the time, and they wanted to know, had I joined a cult? Because I was at the theater every night. I was working for free. As an intern, I was taking a hierarchy of classes, and I talked about it all the time. Those were the only people I was hanging out with all of a sudden. So there were a lot of red flags. I don't believe it was a cult because I don't believe I was being exploited. It helped my career quite a bit, in fact. Also, there wasn't really a charismatic leader, or at least not one who was alive.
Well, who was the dead charismatic leader? Was there one?
Del Close. Del Close,
oh,
Brad,
right.
The inventor of long-form comedy, well, more or less, primary developer of long-form comedy. We had pictures of him, old bearded white dude. We had pictures of him on the wall. I would remember my friend was telling me someone made a documentary about him, and we screened it at the theater, and we were all excited, and he was weeping afterward.
So, like, not a cult, but like close enough that like it gave you a taste.
Yeah, a little culty, yeah.
Yeah, a little culty.
And look, that's the fun part of it, right? That's the first act of every documentary, is a bunch of cool people artists or trying to make the world better or whatever it is, hanging out, having fun and doing their own thing outside of the walls of, whatever society tells them they should be. That's the good part. The first act of any cult documentary, I always want to join.
Yeah. We're working for free. We're weeping in front of a picture of an old bearded dude.
Sign me up.
But that's you raise a good point, because I think that when we think of the aftermath of the cult experience, when things kind of implode and everybody drinks the poison Kool-Aid or whatever, and it becomes this sort of spectacular tragedy, that's the part that I think lingers in the imagination. But there is something alluring. People wouldn't be joining these things if there wasn't a good part, right? It's not all of it. It's not all a nightmare. It often begins with a really deep sense of community and connection and a sense of mission then develops that I think really brings people an authentic feeling of happiness.
Yeah. No one knowingly joins a cult, right? They're tricked from the beginning. And they're really delicious looking candy that's being held out from the car of the van or the door of the van, right? Cults are always claiming to try to make the world a better place because they want to pull in well-meaning people. They don't want to pull in more con artists, right? They want to pull in people who really do want to change the world. And a lot of cults also start out pretty good, and then the leader gets completely corrupted by power. That's a thing that happens from time to time as well. Or leadership is usurped by someone who has been corrupted by power. There's nothing wrong with wanting to be in community with even somewhat isolated communities. America also has a strong history of commune experiments. None of them was very successful, but they had a big effect on American culture. And the idea that you can go out with a group of people and experiment that way, experiment with the way you live, is cool. And when you can bring back from that something that shapes culture in turn, that's a benefit. The problem is the exploitation. The problem is the typically narcissistic, power-hungry person at the top who's become a dictator, right?
I think that I think forming healthy communities is really difficult to do. I think the evidence is in abundance. Human beings have a tough time with it, but I think it's vitally important. We need people who are good at that to do that a lot. I think it's something that's missing from life, especially this digital existence that we're living. People are kind of starved for it, whether they know it or not. And it's really tough to do, in-person healthy communities. And do you have that same sense? Do you feel like that's part of the solution, is people learning how to build healthy communities that don't have this kind of dictatorial power structure and this financial exploitation piece? Is it possible for people to do that?
Absolutely, it's possible. It's about the leadership structure. That's the most important thing, is setting up checks and balances on leadership. Once that's in place, really go do whatever you want, as long as you don't hurt people. because again, that's where the exploitation comes from, is the unchecked power. I joke in the book that we should be testing people for narcissism, for narcissistic personality disorders, before we put them in positions of leadership. And obviously that could never happen. That's fraught with all of the sorts of things that a democracy fights against. But it's an interesting idea. And if we could together as communities do a better job of kind of sussing people out before giving them power, I think that would go a long way. But I think generally speaking, turning toward one another is the answer to all of our cult-like problems in this nation. That's how you stop us versus them thinking. Following World War II, some researchers wanted to figure out why the Gentiles who had helped Jews had done so. And so they, in Europe. And so they started investigating their profiles, their social profiles. And they couldn't find any commonalities there. Among the Gentiles who had helped Jews, there were young and old, rich and poor, men and women, professional and working class, and et cetera, et cetera. The only commonality researchers found was that each of these Gentiles had known a Jew prior to the war. Someone they had worked with, or their child had befriended at school, a nanny, whatever it was. And so what that tells me is that when you know people, you don't hate them. And maybe we don't need research to tell us this. Maybe that's something we know inherently. But I think that, and we were talking about this earlier, that's the reason why isolation fuels us versus them thinking. Because when we're isolated from one another, we don't see each other, and it becomes much easier to dehumanize one another. And there's a very it's not simple, but it's understandable process that happens physically in us, in our brains, when we dehumanize one another. And what will interrupt that process is knowing one another, seeing one another as part of community instead of outside community. And that happens by turning toward one another. And it's so easy to do. It doesn't require any kind of legislation or changing party leadership or restructuring the electoral college. It just means turning to people in your community.
Yeah. I mean, I see this in evidence, like I'm thinking of like gay rights, and I bet the same would hold true. Like people who are in favor of gay rights, who might be traditionally conservative or whatever, often have a gay member of their family, or they have like a hairdresser or a friend or whoever it is, who they know. And that informs their bearing. But what I want to say is that I feel like there are some people who need to actually know somebody in their life, and it's got to have personal stakes in order for them to be invested in the humanity of other people. And then there are people who don't and can just imagine it. Like, and so I don't know. I feel like I'm kind of trying to promote books and literature here.
I was just going to say that's what reading does, right?
Yeah. I mean, I can't help but say it. I feel like people who need to know somebody in their personal life in order to care about them probably are not the kind of people who are reading books regularly, because books, I think, perform this function maybe better than any other art form in terms of letting you access the inner lives of others and imagine like what it's like to be somebody else.
It's a parasocial relationship as opposed to a social relationship, but it's still a relationship. And the TV show Will and Grace had a measurable effect on the acceptance of gay people and gay culture in our nation. This has been studied by social scientists extensively. And that was a parasocial relationship that these characters were in our living rooms. Certainly gay characters had existed on TV before, but not as the main characters, not in a mainstream, network primetime show that ran for as many seasons.
Well, speaking of like pervasive and popular narratives in American culture, there's something in your book that I want to talk about, which is what you call the American monomyth. I don't think you coined this term, but you're drawing on the work of a couple of authors. I think it's Robert Jewett and John Shelton Lawrence. And they came up with this theory of the American monomyth, which has something to do with like the cultiness of America. And I'd just like to hear you talk a little bit about that.
This work fascinated me. This work, when I found this book on the shelves in the Los Angeles Public Library, I sat down immediately and started reading it and lost time to the degree that a librarian came and asked me please to move. I can't recommend this book enough, although it is hard to find currently. But they updated the book, and there are a couple of different later editions because this was in the 70s, and those you can find. But basically, these two guys at Morningside College, they were chatting one day in the hallway. This was during the Vietnam War. Just shocked over the ability of the American public to stomach the violence that was coming out of the Vietnam War in our living rooms, in our televisions for the first time. And they kept pulling that thread and eventually developed what they call the American monomyth, or they didn't develop it. They developed the theory around the American monomyth. And they saw it, sadly, they've both passed, everywhere in American pop culture. books and film and television. And so this is the narrative that they find so pervasive. There's a small Edenic-like community that's under some kind of threat and is unable to save itself. The police are bumbling, the politicians are corrupt, but then out of nowhere, an outsider or a loner appears and rescues the community through violence. It's always violence, and it's always precise violence. Only the bad guys get it. Therefore, it's cleansing violence. Therefore, it's righteous. And this is every Western, pretty much. It's pretty much every comic book. It's every disaster film, every vigilante film. We see it, like today, I think in April, there were 3 movies, major blockbusters alone that follow this narrative. So it's still very prevalent. And in their book, they trace it mostly to the development of Westerns, which they say they argue, came out of a literary form known as Indian captivity narratives, which was Puritan. So at the time when the Puritans were settling the Massachusetts Bay Colony, settlers would be kidnapped from time to time by their neighbors, by the indigenous neighbors. And after someone was rescued from such peril, they would write their story. They would write their narrative. And these became known as Indian captivity narratives. And Jewett and Lawrence noted that there's often this notion of cleansing happening, that the community is cleansed following the rescue, the violent rescue, and the wilderness is cleansed, etc. I trace it back even farther, and they touch on this as well, but to the book of Revelation, the last book in the New Testament of the Bible, with which the Puritans were obsessed. They could not get enough of this story. I mean, we still can't. Americans are still obsessed with this, which was a story of divine rescue, divine violent, dizzyingly violent rescue at the supposed end of the world. It's a doomsday narrative. And after I read that book and after I looked more into the book of Revelation and made that connection, it became impossible for me to watch TV and film because it is literally everywhere. I mean, we just can't stop retelling the story.
And it's worth noting that the book of Revelation, this was part of the your book that was interesting to me, like that it wasn't on my radar, but the book of Revelation was written by John, but not the John who wrote the Gospel of John, but John of Patmos, who was himself like an exile, right? He was living on some island in exile.
He on the island of Patmos. So that's why he's called John of Patmos. He wasn't from there, probably. I'm not sure we know where he's from. Jerusalem or somewhere close by. Presumably he was Jewish. At the time, there was a faction of Jews who believed in Jesus. And he had been exiled to Patmos. This was following when some Jews tried to revolt against the Romans, and then the Romans just absolutely crushed them and destroyed the temple. This was late 1st century. And Jesus had said, or at least the Gospels write that Jesus had said, that he would return within their lifetimes. And so it had been, 60, 70 years or so, or I think by the time Revelation was written, it had been about 60 years, and he still hadn't returned. And people were beginning to fear a failure of prophecy, right? And to respond to that, to the cognitive dissonance that occurs following a failure of prophecy, John wrote this Revelation. So Revelations were a literary format at the time. A lot of Revelations were written. This is really the only one that's survived to the degree that we are talking about it now. And a revelation is just a work of literature that explores something that's been revealed. Typically what's revealed is the end of time. So apocalypse comes from apocalypsis, which means an uncovering. And so this specific revelation written by this guy, John, was about how the world was going to end. And it was all just thinly coded political complaint, right? So the Whore of Babylon is Rome. The 666 is a reference to Nero. the cruelest of the Roman emperors. The idea was that God was going to, and through Jesus, was going to destroy Rome, their persecutors. And that was going to bring about the end of the world, the fall of the Roman Empire. So part of the reason that the book of Revelation got canonized in the Bible, however many centuries later, is because people mistook this guy John as being the Gospel of John, who had been Jesus's disciple John, and they thought, well, anything written by that guy ought to be in the Bible. In fact, scholars are almost totally in agreement now that they're clearly written by two different people. The styles of writing are different, among other flags. And there were other reasons why it got canonized. This one power player really wanted it to be in there because it served his own political ends, and so he was pushing it through as well. But I think it's interesting to note that even at the time of canonization, a lot of people were like, no, I don't like this. I don't think so. This is weird. It seems against our mission, right? And of course, even today, we still see power players pushing this narrative because it serves their own end. And we heard, Donald Trump uses this kind of apocalyptic language. He referred to 2024, to the election, as our final battle, right? That language is still with us. And every time that American foreign policy uses a phrase like, well, for example, World War I, the war to end all wars, that's a reference to the apocalypse, to the book of Revelation. That's what that is. The battle hymn of the Republic in the Civil War is very directly a reference to, mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He's tramping out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. Those are direct references to the book of Revelation. So this idea that we can stamp out sin, the abolitionist movement leading up to the Civil War believed that slavery was the one glaring sin that was keeping Jesus from returning. They thought that we had, as a society, perfected ourselves to the degree that New Jerusalem would come, that we could reach New Jerusalem ourselves. We didn't have to wait for Jesus to return. Through progress, through social reform movements, temperance movement, as I mentioned, abolition movement, these all came out of this kind of social reform of the late 1800s, designed to perfect society. And they supported the Civil War for that reason. Well, once we get past this, once we abolish our nation's last glaring sin, we can become perfect and we can be one with Jesus. Of course, that didn't happen.
I was going to say, still waiting.
Still waiting. Yeah.
Well, and I gotta, every time I hear this kind of talk, I have to confess, I feel alienated in a really kind of extreme way. The idea that there are all of these grown-ups who genuinely believe that Jesus is going to come back. Nothing against Christianity or the principles or ideals of caring for thy neighbor. And I love all that stuff, but I'm just I can't bring myself to even begin to access belief in the idea that this guy's going to somehow return from the sky or whatever it is. And it feels like a kid's story to me that grownups have glommed onto. It seems a little crazy to me, but that's just me.
Apocalyptic thinking developed, some scholars believe, among communities who were being persecuted as a way for them to get through. This idea of divine rescue and punishment gave them hope, helped them persevere. So there are elements to it that are not destructive. The problem becomes when our attraction to these stories is manipulated by someone who manufactures a persecutor, manufactures a threat in order to trigger apocalyptic thinking in us, because that also triggers us versus them thinking. So my beef with the book of Revelation is not the hope that a people will be rescued from persecution. I mean, the Romans were assholes,
yeah,
right?
Right.
My beef with it is this idea that it's been used so many times since then to trigger people to hate, which is very unchristian. And, you know, I can't speak for Jesus posthumously, but I feel like he wouldn't be into it.
Well, yeah, something that this section of your book talks about is how the American monomyth and like revelation-like narratives have a way of undermining collective responsibility. They're kind of rooted in this paternalism and this sort of waiting for a superhero mentality. There's going to be some kind of like spiritual daddy, usually, or I guess maybe a spiritual mommy too sometimes, but like that comes and saves us. And these narratives, when they are misused, they tend to like relieve people of a feeling of responsibility. They can undermine democracy. And it's worth noting that the allure of these kinds of narratives and this kind of paternalistic, like waiting for somebody to come save us mentality is, I think what you're saying is part of the problem. It's not helping us.
That's right. You know, most, as Jewett and Lawrence point out, most cultures have myths that support their defining group ideologies. This American monomyth undermines our defining ideology, if you consider democracy to be our foundational idea, because it trains us to believe that all our problems will be solved by this divine outsider. You know, when I was developing the book, my editor and I were kept talking about how America's flirting with autocracy. Well, we're no longer flirting with it. We're living under it for the most part. And I think that's because we wanted it. Not each of us individually, but I think collectively, we are very attracted to the idea of a strongman, or a spiritual daddy, as you said, which I love. A saddie? Is that what it's a spatty? I don't know how that would go. Who's going to come and fix all our problems, right? It encourages us to sit back and wait instead of engaging in the messy and laborious work of democracy, of working with one another, of turning toward one another and compromising.
Yeah. And I mean, it's like the irony, like the grim irony of the whole thing is that there is not a less spiritual man in the world than Donald Trump. And the fact that all of these Christians have like identified him as kind of the savior or whatever of their movements, just, it's mind blowing to me. I guess they feel like, it's whatever. He may be the devil, but he's our devil. I've kind of heard that sort of sentiment expressed where they've realized that he can help them advance their aims, even if he's not necessarily the perfect embodiment of their movement or whatever.
Well, that fits very nicely with the myth of the Anglo-Saxon, which I believe this is the same chapter I explore the myth of the Anglo-Saxon in, which was this idea very common in, the 1700s and 1800s. I mean, it hasn't gone anywhere. This idea that God specifically chose the Anglo-Saxon people to carry his true church, right? Since Luther nailed his theses to the church doors in Germany, the Anglo-Saxons, of course, in England, the Anglo-Saxon people came from two different groups out of Germany, Saxony and Anglia. And then it was carried from Germany to England, with the development of the Anglican Church and that branch of Protestantism. And then from there to Massachusetts, the Puritan Protestantism, and spread west, right? This is part of the argument for manifest destiny. And that spreading ever west, by the way, because that's the path that the sun follows. And there's some Bible verse, I'm not going to remember exactly, that wheresoever the sun shines is God's people, something like that. But so the idea that the Anglo-Saxons were chosen specifically by God for this purpose is because they were conquerors, because they were up to the task, because they were accustomed to the nomadic life, because they had the bravery that was required for such a task. Now, people who supported the myth of the Anglo-Saxon were careful to say that God didn't condone the other unsavory qualities that came along with being a conquering group. But nevertheless, that's what could he do, right? That was just part of it. In order to have the bravery and the courage and the nomadic nature, you had to have the other stuff. And so, I guess we may have been a devil, but we were his devil.
So I guess like another natural question to ask is like, when you think about cults in America and like the present state of America, we're not going to be able to cover most of it because your book contains so much, but there are religious cults. There are, like, I would say, like capitalism cults. Like you mentioned MLMs, I think more than once in this conversation, like multi-level marketing schemes like Amway. There are so many different permutations and manifestations of this stuff. And I guess like I found myself wondering as I was reading, is like, I wonder where Jane is like spiritually. Like, do you seem like you have like an interest in religion as like a social science or an area of study, but like, what's your orientation? Like, how do you conceive of like the big mystery of it all?
First of all, from the sort of scholarship side of things, I'm a big fan of Joseph Campbell. I studied him quite a bit. He's the hero with 1,000 faces guy who compared myths from cultures throughout history and found all the commonalities. And I believe that ultimately every religion is trying to get at the same thing. The stories are, in my opinion, works of art designed to express what is ultimately ineffable. And that's why each of these efforts to define the ineffable is somewhat different and is unique to that culture. And so I believe that actually all of these different religious stories connect us because we're all trying to explain the same thing. On the other side of the spectrum, I'm a big fan of psychedelics, big supporter of psychedelics in general, because in part, I think that's efforting at the same thing. It's trying to experience the ineffable, trying to touch it, so to speak.
Well, yeah, I think like psychedelics are really experiential it's like as overtly as experiential as it gets, as opposed to like ideological or somebody just like preaching at you or you're believing in some book. Like, that's what I like about psychedelics, is that they're sort of inarguable. Like, if you buy the ticket, you're going to take the ride. It's like once you get on, you're going to have a big experience, whether you like it or not.
And I like it. I like it, Brad.
Yeah.
And look, doctrine has its place. I don't necessarily have a problem with doctrine because I think it serves a similar purpose as government regulations, which I'm also a big supporter of. So it would be hypocritical of me to criticize doctrine in that way. I think that if you just expect people to behave well and then say, okay, very good, go on your way and be a good person, that's not necessarily going to happen. We have to have corporate oversight. We have to have government regulations, or we see what's happening. It's happening now with the monopolies and the fact that we've allowed the billionaires to take all the money. So in the same way, church doctrine has historically mostly been moral. These are the ways you behave in our community. And if you don't, you'll either be punished by us or by God, right? There've been some theories that monotheistic gods developed around the time when communities got too big to police themselves. So suddenly there was this policeman in the sky, right? These things serve a purpose. And when the doctrines are moral, great. I was raised in a Presbyterian church. I had a very positive experience growing up in my Presbyterian church. No one was trying to control me. No one was trying to foment us versus them thinking or make me hate other people. My church did a lot of outreach in the community. We fed the hungry. We built homes. I don't have a problem with that. The problem is when people manipulate believers with doctrine designed to instill hate. And typically when that happens, it's to serve the purposes of the person doing the indoctrinating.
So I want to leave people with like a bit of hope. I want people to, I think America as a place of cultiness, it's pretty inarguable. And I think we're seeing it all around us in not so great ways. But your book does take a moment to talk about possible solutions. Like something that you said more than once in this conversation is that we need to turn toward each other, not turn away from each other. I think that's a foundational element of a way forward that would be healthier. But are there other things that you would suggest people do, or like ways that we can think of the future that might move us away from like cultiness and doomsday ideologies and the more toxic aspects of our Puritan roots?
I think, if we're not going to talk about the touchy-feely stuff, but although I will talk more about that, but I think we have to resource people in America. I think the source of most of the cult-like thinking happening societally right now is the result of people being in crisis because they're chronically under-resourced. So since 1975, $65 trillion have moved from 90% of Americans to 1% of Americans. And that is a state of crisis. And as we've discussed, cults.
Wait, say that again, because that's like a staggering number.
It's a staggering number. So there was a study done that traced from 1975 to 2020, $50 trillion moved from bottom 90% to the top 1%. And Robert Reich recently updated that statistic to 65 trillion if you take it through to today.
Wow.
Yeah, it's staggering. And it's happened through tax cuts to the rich. It's happened through the removal of regulations that were protecting the public and workers from corruption. It's happened from moving jobs offshore and leaving American workers in the dust. It's happened through supposedly innovative financial technologies that in fact just charge the poor for their own poverty. This all stems, in my opinion, from the Puritan tendency to connect the number in a person's bank account with their morality. So we tend to worship the wealthy in our nation, and we tend to blame the poor for their own poverty. And I think that is the number one reason of why we got here, is that tendency in us. And I trace that through history as well. And so it's out of control right now. And when you resource people and they are no longer in crisis, they're no longer, having to pick up 2 or 3 additional jobs, blowing through their savings, going into debt. People are no longer in crisis. They will no longer fall for con artists and demagogue and salespeople, snake oil salespeople. Now, do we have the political will to do that? I mean, eventually it's going to happen one way or the other, right? Look at the French Revolution. Hopefully we can do it without that many people dying, but one way or another, it's going to correct itself. I mean, human history tells us that much. This can't hold. This current situation we're in can't hold. I think the way to get the political will to resource people is by turning toward one another. This is what we see so often in the history of racism in America. We see empowered white people pitting poor white people against blacks because they know that when they're divided, they won't come together to unionize. They won't come together to fight for financial equity if they're too busy thinking about, racial equity or lack thereof. And so only when we turn toward one another and band together in that way can we start to turn the tide on the financial crime, in my opinion, that's led to the crisis we're currently in.
So economic justice, like getting closer to the ideal of real economic justice, is an antidote to cultiness.
100%. And that's not the only division that can be healed. Also, there's a division within the self. This also comes from our Puritan quote unquote founders. They believed that in what I call the grace nature divide, this idea that God has given people grace and no other creature or plant on the planet has it. It's this unique thing that makes us special. And if you have grace, you're chosen, meaning you're going to be saved on Judgment Day. And then everything in nature, if grace is holy, then everything in nature must be evil. And so that has justified extraction economics for however many centuries. That is what justified the transatlantic slave trade and the resettlement and genocide of indigenous peoples. This idea that they did not have grace, therefore they were part of nature, therefore they were evil. And God gave us nature to use for our own benefit, right? So we can use slave labor, and we can use the silver we find inside a mountain, because we're doing that for the glory of God, for the betterment of ourselves and his chosen people, and therefore for the glory of God. And so this grace-nature divide, I believe, is also at the heart of the financial exploitation we're seeing. Because if you believe that the wealthy deserve what they received because they got it from God, and that the poor deserve what they haven't received because God assessed them and deemed them to be sinners, then you believe that the poor are part of this, are part of nature, and therefore you can exploit them. And I 100% believe that that's what's happening. Now, these people at insert big financial institution who create some of these supposed services that charge the poor for their own poverty. I'm thinking about, overdraft fees, for example, on checking accounts, which are not necessary. Like, if you don't have money, then you just can't cash the check, right? Instead of them cashing the check for you and you get charged through. Anyway, I think 85% of all the revenue that came out of that in, development, financial development, came from the poor. So I think subconsciously, because we are all indoctrinated into this idea of the wealthy as deserving and the poor as sinners, that we've allowed that kind of stuff to happen. So when we can bridge the grace-nature divide, when we can bring mind and matter back together as one, we will also become less easily influenced and less easily conquered. Turning back to Nexium, the Keith Raniere's cult in Albany, I talked to some former members of that group who said that he was always telling people, don't listen to your gut instinct. That's just your body, having some confusion or whatever. It's your mind. Think about what your mind is saying. And so that made his followers easier to control and easier to conquer. So that's another division that I would like to bridge.
Well, I mean, it's just like, as I listen to you talk, I can't help but think about like major religious institutions and how antiquated they can often seem when it comes to the needs of like contemporary society, or how rigid they can be in their ideology and like the kind of refusal to evolve. And like, you talk about people turning towards one another, shrooming, all of these things are great. And I think like economic justice is a huge piece of it. But I wonder if like real movement is possible when these major religious institutions, which so many people kind of center their lives around, are not maybe talking to them in a way that's in sync with like our contemporary understanding of reality. I don't know. It just feels like I get frustrated with it. I'm a frustrated, like, recovering Catholic. So this has been like a narrative that I've carried with me my whole life, where I'm just like, I wish they would just talk about things differently. I know there's good in there, but the language that's being used is not serving us. And we're kind of clinging to these, like when I was a kid, things actually have shifted, because when I was a kid, they did talk about like cardinal sins and like burning in hell for eternity, which was wonderful as a 6-year-old.
Yeah.
But that doesn't happen as much anymore. Like somehow they've moved off that. They finally were like, yeah, that's not working for people. And the gig is up. But that's that sort of thing that I think needs to happen. There need to be fundamental shifts in that space as well, if people are going to relate to one another, especially across spiritual divides, and with people who have no spiritual tradition. There's got to be shifting happening there. And I feel like there's often a lot of like institutional resistance to that sort of thing. So
yeah.
I don't know. I think we have to dose the bishops. Is that what we have to do?
Sign me up.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot in this book, and we kind of gave people a primer, but it's a really rich resource and incredibly fascinating. Thanks. So I offer you kudos for what must have been a ton of research.
It was a lot of research. Simon & Schuster basically paid me to read.
And I always close by asking my guest if they're working on anything else. Like, do you have anything else in the pipeline? I know you do, like, journalism and stuff, but are there any other books that you're considering or working on?
I'm still waiting for the book idea to develop, but I'm going to be launching a podcast, which will hopefully lead me to the book idea. It's going to be a highbrow take on orgasm.
Oh. So like a nonfiction book possibly coming out of this, like some sort of...
Yes. Yeah.
It's going to be popular. I feel like people will like that. It seems like...
I hope so.
Yeah.
We'll see. It's going to be challenging to do it without, people making a bunch of dumb jokes and...
Comes with the territory.
We'll see if I can pull it off.
Does it have a name or their working title?
The Little Death.
The Little Death. There you go.
Mm-hmm. Petit more.
All right, Jane. Well, it's a pleasure to meet you, and I wish you well with The Little Death.
Thanks.
Okay, everybody, there we have it. That was my conversation with Jane Borden. Her book is called Cults Like Us, Why Doomsday Thinking Drives America. It's out there now from Atria. You can find out more about Jane and her work at janeborden.com. I believe she is on Instagram. And again, the book is called Cults Like Us. Go get your copy immediately. It will help you understand what's going on a little bit better. So great conversation with Jane. Appreciate her taking the time to drop in on the program. Don't forget to subscribe to this show wherever you listen. You can also subscribe on YouTube, and you can follow me on Bluesky and Instagram. If you want to get my weekly email newsletter, you can sign up over at bradlisti.substack.com. If you are a regular listener of this show and you get something from it, if it offers you something of meaning, I hope you will support the show over at patreon.com/otherpplpod. And if you want to join my book club, the Other People Book Club, or if you want to get an Other People t-shirt or a sweatshirt, you can do all of those things at the show's official website, otherppl.com. If you want to find out more about Deep Dive, my new company, which is launching on Tuesday, August 12th, the website is www.deepdive.audio. Finally, if you have 2 minutes and you want to help me out a little bit, please give this show a rating wherever you listen. So Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever it is, give the show a rating. Write a little review if that's an option. It helps the show in the algorithm, and it helps it find new listeners. All right, so coming up on Tuesday, I will have a new episode for you, I think. I never tell you who the guest is going to be unless I have the conversation on tape already. I am superstitious. I don't want to declare anything until it's actual. It's actually like on my hard drive. So a new episode coming on Tuesday, a conversation with an author, to be determined. Stay tuned.